Every science lesson should have a set of objectives. What are you trying to accomplish with that particular lesson? These objectives can range from the content area through the process skills. Let's take an example as we study STEMs. There are three main objectives. The first one is the student should be able to identify the main function of the stem, at least two reasons that the stem is important to the plant. Secondly, they should be able to identify different types of stems and differentiate between a monocot and a dicot. Thirdly, the student should be able to identify two parts of a stem, interior parts, and identify the function of those two parts. On the process side, if they're using their magnifiers and looking at little cross sections of stems or using the microprojector, they'll be making good observations and recording their data. So you're working once again on their process skills in this area. There are two main types of stems, and a good way to have your students discover this is to bring some samples in. Have them identify characteristics of each one. They should find that they fall into one of two categories. The woody stem, which has a very rigid, rough, dark-colored surface, or the herbaceous stem, like these corn plants that have smooth, green, flexible stems. Incidentally, the woody stem is usually a perennial. It comes from a tree or a shrub, and they live from one year on to the next. And the herbaceous plants are called annuals. They usually die out in 1 year of growth, around fall or winter. You can go on and have an activity where you take different plants and stems and put them at different stations throughout the room, and your student groups go around and identify the plant or stem at each station as being a woody or a herbaceous stem. You may even throw some asparagus or some celery in at one of the stations. Incidentally, if you look at this corn, you see that it's tilted off to one angle. This, of course, is because the plant leans toward the sun. Your students may ask you why the plant leans toward the sun. It's actually growing toward the sun. A good way to demonstrate this is to have a student stand up and say, what would happen to you if half of your body started growing more than the other half? Say your right leg got longer than your left leg, and everything on this side of your body got longer, and everything on this side stayed the same. What would happen to your body? Well, it would start to bend, because this gets longer and longer and starts to bend more and more, and your leg gets longer, and pretty soon you start bending way off to one side. That's what's happening to this plant. There's certain chemicals in the plant called auxins. They stimulate the cell growth. These auxins have a tendency to migrate toward the shady side. So on this corn plant, there's more auxins on the shady side to make these cells grow more than the ones on the inside. If I turn the plant around, then the auxins will migrate to the opposite side now and stimulate plant growth on this side, thereby straightening the plant out and then eventually bending it back this way toward the sun. You might ask your students why plants have this capability. What benefit is it to them to be able to bend toward the sun? Let's continue to take a look at stems. Go back to the old standby, the celery and the blue water, and this celery's been in here for about a week, and all the leaves are really quite saturated with this blue liquid. You can slice some very thin cross sections and allow your students to observe them under a magnifier. They should find out that there's all these tiny little tubes that carry liquid through the celery. This is a stem. If you slice it longitudinally, you'll see the little blue veins. In fact, you can see some of them if you look really closely without even slicing it. Your students should also have the opportunity to observe the leaves with their magnifiers. When they look very closely, they'll see all the veins inside the leaf that are now stained with the blue food coloring. So the function of the stem is not only to transport liquids from the roots to the leaves, but also move the food from the leaf throughout the rest of the plant. And besides that, the stem gives the plant strength and allows the plant to grow up high above the ground. Another related activity is to get an ear of corn that has a little stem sticking out from the bottom and slice thin sections of that stem with a sharp knife. You may end up with little sections like this. Give each student group one of these and have them stain it with either a marking pen by rubbing the marking pen on it or some ink. And then look very closely at it with their little magnifiers, just like we did in some of the previous experiments. They will see all the tiny little bundles of tubes that are going through the stem of this corn. What we're going to do next is take a look at a cross-section of the same type of corn, but now under the microprojector, and it's a very, very thin cross-section, and we can see much better the detail of these little bundles. Recall that corn with its parallel veined leaves is a monocot. Here's now another characteristic of monocots, and that is that the bundles are scattered throughout the stem. A good way to remember this is to relate the scattering of the bundles to the scattering of corn in a field. Now the fun begins. When we look closely at each bundle, it looks like a tiny little face. Have your students draw pictures of these. The large tubes are called the xylem tissue. They carry water throughout the plant. The tiny tubes are called the phloem, and they carry the food. Relate water with xylem as WX in the alphabet, and remember food flows to relate the phloem to the transportation of food. Now let's see how dicots differ from monocots. This is the cross-section of a stem from a pumpkin plant, a dicot. Here we notice that the bundles are situated in an orderly arrangement. The xylem or water transport cells are large and have thick walls. These cells help to give the stem support. The phloem cells are located nearby and are smaller. Note also the extra strength of the cells at the outer edge of this herbaceous plant. Remember that if the bundles are scattered throughout the stem, it's a monocot. If they're found in a circular arrangement, then it's a dicot. Now let's take a look at the woody stem. This is a cross-section from the stem of a pine tree. All of the growth occurs around this layer right here called the cambium layer. Whenever you see this cambium layer, it's usually from a woody stem. The phloem cells are located on the outside of the cambium layer, and the xylem cells are located on the inside. Now here's a test question. This slide is of the stem of a hibiscus plant. Does this plant have a woody stem or a herbaceous stem? Now it might be time to bring out the tree ring samples and have your students take another look at them. Remember that the growth in a tree, because it's a woody plant, occurs around the cambium layer. In the summertime, the cells in the cambium layer are quite thick and make the dark rings. In the springtime, they're quite thin and make the white area between each dark ring. So you have these annular rings, and you can identify the age of a tree by counting the rings. You may have your students take a more advanced look at these and notice the distance between the rings. What does it mean if there's a wide distance between the rings compared to a short distance? Does it mean that the environmental conditions were better for growth for that tree during those years? If you don't have all of these tree ring samples available, you can always Xerox them and hand out the Xerox copies as an alternative to a sample. At the end of your lesson, you should once again review your objectives. Make sure that you reinforce the ideas that you want the students to learn. For example, can they now identify two functions of the stem, the support and the movement of food and water? Can they also identify the difference between a monocot and a dicot stem by looking at microscope slides? Or the difference between a woody stem and a herbaceous stem? Finally, can they identify at least two parts in the stem? Name the two different types of tubes in the bundles that carry the food and the water. Now we turn to the final part of the plant, the roots. And once again, you'll find much valuable material for developing the students' process skills. There are several functions of roots. They anchor the plant in place, and they absorb the necessary minerals and water that the plant needs to survive. Some roots are used for reproducing new plants, where shoots of plants actually come off the root. And other roots are used to store food. First, we'll classify roots into the three main areas in which they're found. Are they found in the water, in the air, or in the soil? Some plants have roots in the air. These are called aerial roots. Other plants, like this Alidea that I've had in my fish tank for a while, has actual roots that are growing into the water. And you can see that these roots don't have the branching extensions like other types of plants have, because these are specialized for an aquatic type plant. Incidentally, this whole length of plant grew in a period of only about 2 weeks. It's a very fast growing plant. When we investigate plants that grow in soil, we see many different types of roots. You may have your students once again bring samples in and set the samples up at different stations. Have them identify, record the particular type of roots that that plant has. Let's take a look at three main types. The first type of root is called the taproot system. It's one long root that stretches deep into the ground. Little tiny roots that come off the side are called secondary roots. The next type of root system is called the fibrous root system, and we find this with grasses. In this case, we don't have a main taproot, but really hundreds and hundreds of tiny little roots. This type of system is exceptional in holding soil together and helping to prevent erosion. The third type of root system is called the adventitious root system. And in this case, the word adventitious means that the roots are growing from a part of the plant that they're not supposed to grow from. In other words, they're not growing from the root system itself. When you're growing corn, you may see these roots coming off the stem and going around and down into the soil. That is an adventitious root system. If you try and grow this pothos by cutting a stem off and putting it in water, you'll see the roots start to grow off the stem. These roots, incidentally, have been growing in water now for about 2 months. As we look further up the stem of this plant, we see some interesting things. Here's some more adventitious roots growing off this upper portion of the plant. While your students are going around comparing and identifying different types of root systems, you may also have them compare roots of the same variety of plant and see how the size of the root differs as the plant gets older. Let me give you an example. Here's some milkweed. Here's a very old plant, and here's a much younger plant. And you can see the difference in the root sizes. You can see also that it's a taproot system. Incidentally, you may be in for a few surprises when you're doing this, like I was, and I noticed all the what appears to be aphids living on this little plant. Science is sometimes like that, so you shouldn't hesitate to change your lesson and bring out the magnifiers and allow your students to get a real close view of these strange-looking bugs. Another thing you can do is have your students grow onion sets, little tiny bulbs. Some of the students can grow them in plain water in a moist paper towel, and others can grow them in a small Dixie cup with vermiculite inside. You can have the students pull the onion out and take a look at the roots once the onion is growing for a while. If you compare this one to the one that's grown in the water, you see quite a difference. The onion in the vermiculite has a much more well-developed root system. Remember that some roots store food, and some of them store so much food that we actually eat them. A good example is a carrot. And you can slice carrots into small pieces and have your students look at them with the magnifiers. They may see 3 separate sections in the interior part of the carrot. In the very center, we also have the xylem and the phloem. Remember those tubes? The food flows. It carries the food, and the xylem carries the water throughout the plant. If you look at this carrot, you can imagine it as a giant taproot. And if you slice off about this much carrot and place this upper part in vermiculite, you can make a very nice plant. I've had mine growing now for about 2 months, and not only does it have lots of leaves, but if you look at the root system inside the cup, you see it's quite extensive. When we propagate plants in this fashion, growing new plants from old plant parts, it's called vegetative reproduction, and it's a form of asexual reproduction. This is where you're making a new plant, and it's actually a clone of the original plant. We can grow a carrot in this fashion. We can also grow our pothos, like you saw earlier, by just planting this root now in soil. Some other plants we can work with are the spider plant. By placing it in water, we can grow some great roots, and even an African violet by just pulling a leaf off and placing it in water for a number of weeks. This has been in water now for about 4 weeks. Once this leaf is planted in soil, it'll slowly turn into a beautiful African violet plant like this one. Another plant that's good for vegetative reproduction is the sweet potato, and you've probably all tried to grow one of these, just like I have. Mine's been in water now for about 3 weeks, and this is all I'm getting from this side of the potato. And did you know that I never had the opportunity to grow one of these when I was in elementary school? In fact, this is the first one I've ever tried to grow. I certainly hope it grows a lot better than this. Now for the final chapter in our unit on plants, we'll pick up a few of the odds and ends. First, you should introduce the idea that certain plants have special adaptations that allow them to survive under specific environmental conditions. Let's take a few examples. The philodendron plant lives at the lower level of a tropical rainforest where there's very little light. It therefore must have a very large leaf to absorb as much light as possible. As the plant grows taller, the upper level of leaves don't have to have as much surface area because there's more light. In fact, it's not very economical to have a large leaf because there's more energy used by the leaf than there is produced. So there's a certain optimum size of leaf. At the higher levels, the philodendron leaf starts to adapt itself by producing holes in the leaf and thereby reducing the surface area. This is a good plant adaptation. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the desert plants. Here, because water is so scarce, the plants must conserve moisture as best they can. The leaves are very small or waxy. This reduces the amount of water loss from the leaf into the air, the process of respiration. If we take a look at a cactus, we see that it has leaves, little tiny thorns, that are adapted to keep animals from getting in and eating the plant, stealing the moisture from the plant. These little tiny leaves don't have chlorophyll in them. In fact, it's the stem part of the cactus that has the chlorophyll, and that's where the photosynthesis takes place. Now, you may not live in a desert or in a tropical rainforest, but you should be able to find plants in your area that have special adaptations to specific environmental conditions. The next topic you should introduce to your students is the idea of tropisms. It comes from the Greek root word tropos, which means to turn. A tropism is the reaction of a plant to a certain stimuli. Let's take this as an example. This is called a heliotropism because the plant is turning toward the sun. It's also called a positive tropism because it's going toward, not away. If the plant is moving away from a stimuli, it's called a negative tropism. We have other types of tropisms too. This one is called geotropism, and here I've grown a plant upside down. The plant stem moves away from gravity, and the plant roots go toward gravity. It's not difficult to grow a plant upside down. It's a matter of germinating a seed, starting it when it's a very young plant, about that tall. Once it starts to pop through the earth, put a piece of wire screen around it, make sure there's a hole and a slit so you can slide it around the stem of the plant. You can also try wax paper, tape it down, put a rubber band around it, and then make a little string harness to hang under the rubber band, and then simply just hang it upside down for about a week. Aside from these two reactions, we also have chemotropism, which is the reaction of plants to different chemicals, and thigmotropism, which is the reaction of plants to a mechanical stimuli. Here's an example of that. This pea plant has tiny little tendrils that grab onto objects that are solid near it to help give it support. You'll also notice, if you look real closely, that this one's already gone to flower and it has a tiny little pea pod. These reactions to stimuli are valuable because we'll be investigating them again when we study animals. Now, there are two other topics that we should consider in this section. One is the importance of soil to the growth of plants, how plants can get minerals from the soil. You may wish to bring some samples in, as we did in the Earth Science tape, and have your students investigate soil samples with their magnifiers. The other topic is the value of agriculture. Now, this is a technological application where man has learned from science and applied it to the benefit of the society. Here we're producing high yield by using fertilizers and farm machinery and special hybrids of seeds. Throughout this unit on plants, we've done some nasty things to plants by hanging them upside down, for example. But it's important to continue to instill an appreciation for plants. This is what this is all about, and the experiments we're doing are in the interest of understanding how they function and to learn more about them. The final activity is an appreciation activity, and that's making a really nice little terrarium. To do this, it doesn't take much. You start with a soda container. This is a 2-liter variety, and it has clear plastic at the top. Cut the neck off with a razor blade or scissors, and then the hardest part is going to be prying the bottom part off because it's glued on. Some of them come off easier than others. Take the bottom part, fill it with soil, put your small plants in there, put some water in it, and then invert the top part over it. You'll end out with a beautiful terrarium like I have here. In fact, I was really surprised once I started this because I noticed I had some volunteer moss growing down at the bottom. This terrarium, incidentally, has been growing in my kitchen now for over a year, and it makes a real beautiful addition. Well, that concludes part 1 of this life science series. On part 2, we'll investigate the classification scheme, protists, animals, humans, and ecosystems.